When double-action revolvers first came into popular use in the early 1900s, they were really thought of as single actions with a bonus double-action feature that would only be used in dire emergencies. The assumption was if you actually had time to bring the gun up to eye level and use the sights, you also had time to thumb cock the hammer. Of course, today we know it's possible to use the sights and get quick and accurate hits even with a double action trigger stroke. Manually thumb cocking the hammer for the lighter single action shot is no longer considered acceptable in the defensive firearms training world. So why is it that most revolvers made today still have the single action capability? We have plenty of double action only small frame models to choose from, but most people assume that they're useless beyond arm's reach. And for revolvers larger than pocket size, double action only is almost unheard of as a factory option. But history has shown us that the single action capability is not only unnecessary on a defensive revolver, it's actually a liability. Today, the hammer spur is nothing more than a relic of early 20th century police training doctrine that was already outdated 80 years ago. Well after the introduction of the double-action revolver, there were plenty of guys still making good use of single actions. Progress in shooting techniques was to some degree limited by the equipment they had to work with. For example, this is a Smith & Wesson 1905 hand ejector. If you were to try and aim this revolver with the hammer down, all you would see is the back of the hammer spur. You can't actually see the sights at all until the gun is cocked. So it makes perfect sense that even an experienced shooter from that time would pick up one of those revolvers and assume that double action and accurate shooting are mutually exclusive. The stocks or grip panels were also designed with single action shooting in mind, and it would be years before grips appeared that positioned the hand to get better leverage for a double action trigger press. More importantly, the police training of the pre-World War II era emphasized one-handed single action as the default technique. The Manual of Police Revolver Instruction, published by the Pennsylvania Highway Patrol in 1932, said that the revolver should only be fired double action in emergency, as when the hammer cannot be cocked by the thumb, or when in very close proximity to the adversary, such as a hand-to-hand scuffle. At greater distances, firing double action will cause muzzle wobble, flinching, and wild shots. It is impossible to keep the sights in proper alignment when the target is at greater distances. But around this same period, in the 1930s, there were a few radical innovators in military and law enforcement training circles who really started to promote the merits of double-action revolver shooting. Guys like William Fairbairn, Rex Applegate, and Jelly Bryce demonstrated that their low stance and hip-level point shooting techniques were quicker and more effective than the old style of single-action target shooting.
With gun in shoulder holster, this criminal was no match for well-trained officers drawing and shooting double action from hip level. Remember, this is the fastest method of firing. It is accurate and effective up to 10 yards. When fired double action from the hip, the revolver is almost lightning fast. The weapon is cocked and fired in one continuous motion of the trigger finger on the trigger.
Even though the FBI encouraged double-action point shooting, it definitely didn't catch on everywhere. But by the 1950s, double-action techniques had received enough validation in actual street encounters that some law enforcement training started to change. You can even see evidence of that in certain guns that were being used around that time. For instance, in 1952, Smith & Wesson introduced the Centennial, a double-action only small frame revolver with an internal hammer. It wasn't their first so-called hammerless design, but the snag-free profile made it one of their best sellers, and derivatives of that model are still popular today. The next big leap forward in shooting techniques came from Jack Weaver in the late 50s and early 60s. Today he's best known for having the Weaver stance named after him, but his bigger contribution was demonstrating in quick draw style competition that a two-handed grip with the gun up at eye level was more accurate and just about as fast as shooting from the hip. Weaver used a Smith & Wesson K38 target revolver with big sights, and he fired the gun double action. This style of shooting was later developed into the modern technique by Jeff Cooper, which is what most of today's handgun techniques are derived from. But in the 60s, these guys represented the absolute cutting edge of combat shooting. Police firearms training in general was very slow to change. In most departments, the guys who would have been considered serious shooters were honing their skills by competing in traditional bullseye-style matches and other forms of competition with pretty generous time limits. The easiest way to excel in these matches was to fire the revolver single action. Firearms instructors were often recruited from the top competitors in these matches, so police training continued to be biased towards single action shooting into the mid-1900s and well beyond. Against all odds, that era did manage to produce some highly successful gunfighters who were also competitive shooters. The most well-known is probably Jim Cirillo from the New York City Stakeout Squad. In the 70s, he won a lot of gunfights, and he also won a lot of bullseye matches, but he always fired his revolver double action, even at 50 yards. Double action shooting was repeatedly shown to be effective in the field, but what probably led police departments to eventually move away from single action was liability issues. Single action and nervous cops in tense situations do not mix. This was recognized as early as 1930 by J.H. Fitzgerald in the book Shooting, where he wrote, "The double action has its advantages for many occasions where the officer must carry his revolver ready for instant use, as in entering a house or room in which he has every reason to believe a criminal is hiding. If he should enter the house with his revolver cocked, a loud noise, as the slamming of a door or throwing of some article, may cause him to fire a shot because less than 1/8 of an inch pull will release the hammer." He goes on to explain that double action is just as quick and a lot less prone to accidental discharge. This advice is from 1930, but a lot of police departments did not de-emphasize single action shooting in their training, their policies, and their equipment until the 70s and 80s. In the meantime, a lot of suspects and innocent bystanders were needlessly injured or even killed as a result of officers trying to use cocked revolvers as people management tools. So how is any of this relevant for the legally armed citizen today? Well, first of all, I think history shows us that single action is just not necessary in the real world. At least 95% of defensive shootings take place inside of 15 yards, which is completely doable with a double action trigger and a modest amount of practice. If you've got a revolver for concealed carry, the hammer spur presents all kinds of opportunities to snag on your clothing and mess up your draw stroke, which is arguably the most important part of the armed response. But even if the snagging thing doesn't worry you, as long as you've got the ability to fire single action, you're going to be tempted to practice that way when you're at the range. Getting the hang of the double action trigger takes some discipline because it can be challenging and maybe even a little discouraging at first. But when you rely on single action at the range, all you're doing is telling your brain that if you really need to hit your target, you've got to thumb that hammer first. We tend to operate on autopilot under extreme stress, so if you practice that way and you ever have to respond to a potential threat, you may end up with a cocked revolver in your hand without ever making a deliberate decision to cock it. Your potential threat is more likely than not going to turn out to be a false alarm or a situation that doesn't require you to actually fire the gun. So now you've got to manually decock the gun while you're all amped up on adrenaline, and that presents a whole new opportunity for an unintentional discharge. For most people, I think the best thing to do is either buy a double action only revolver or have a gunsmith remove the hammer spur and convert your gun to double action only. I know it's kind of funny looking without a hammer, but I promise you'll get over it. If you do keep that single action capability, at the very least, do your best to ignore it, because putting a hole where there should not be one is a lot more likely than picking off a terrorist at 50 yards. Special thanks to Daryl Bolke and Tom Givens for helping out with some of the research on this one. Check out the video description to find out how you can train with them. And if you want to support our channel, the next time you need ammo, get it from LuckyGunner.com.